There's a photograph that Boeing employees used to keep on their desks, and it's from 1968, a group of engineers in short-sleeved dress shirts, slide rules in hand, arguing over blueprints for the 747, not executives, not consultants, engineers, the people who actually built things. And that company, the one in that photograph, was once considered the greatest industrial achievement in American history, a machine so complex, so precisely engineered, that rivals spent decades just trying to understand how it was done. So now ask yourself this: how does a company like that end up with a door falling off a commercial aircraft at 16,000 feet? And more importantly, can spending $4.7 billion actually fix what went wrong, or is Boeing trying to buy back something that can't be purchased? On January 5, 2024, Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 departed Portland, Oregon with 171 passengers on board, and 6 minutes into the flight, a door plug, a panel that fills an unused emergency exit, blew out of the fuselage, and a child's shirt was sucked out, and a passenger nearly went with it, and by some miracle nobody died, and the hole was roughly the size of a refrigerator, and within days investigators found the answer, and it wasn't sabotage, it wasn't a freak event. The door plug was missing 4 bolts. 4 bolts that were supposed to be installed during manufacturing, 4 bolts that if present would have meant you never heard the name Alaska Airlines 1282. The NTSB released its final report in 2025. And here's the part that should make you stop, because investigators didn't conclude this was a one-time oversight. Their finding was that the bolts were never installed because of a systemic breakdown in Boeing's quality management system. No single person forgot, the system forgot, there was no redundant check, no safety net, and the process that was supposed to catch the error had been, over years, quietly dismantled. And that's the contradiction that should keep you watching, because Boeing didn't used to be a company that lost bolts, they used to be the company that invented the systems that made sure bolts were never lost. So what happened between that photograph from 1968 and a door blowing off a plane in 2024? And the answer isn't a person, it's a philosophy, and it took 20 years to do its damage. To understand what Boeing became, you need to understand what Boeing sold, because in 2005 Boeing spun off a huge chunk of its manufacturing operations into a new, independent company called Spirit AeroSystems, based in Wichita, Kansas, and Spirit would take over the production of 737 fuselages, the literal body of the plane, along with major components for the 777 and 787, and on paper it was a clean business decision. Boeing gets to focus on design and final assembly. Spirit handles the messy, expensive, labor-intensive work of actually fabricating fuselages. Costs go down, margins go up, Wall Street applauds. But here's what that spreadsheet didn't capture. Because when you spin off your manufacturing arm, you don't just transfer machinery, you transfer people, institutional memory. The guy who's been torquing door hinges for 22 years and knows from experience that you need a second pass when the humidity is high. The team lead who can look at a fuselage and spot something wrong before any checklist catches it. And Boeing didn't just lose a supplier, they lost the people who knew where the bolts went. And because Spirit was now an independent company, a vendor, with its own shareholders, its own pressures, its own incentive to hit delivery targets, the relationship between Boeing and its most critical partner was never quite right, and Boeing would pressure Spirit to deliver faster, and Spirit would cut corners to comply, and problems would be papered over because both companies needed the contract, and nobody had ultimate ownership over quality. And meanwhile, back at Boeing headquarters in Chicago, and yes, the symbolism of that matters, they moved the headquarters away from the engineers in Seattle to a city of bankers. The financial engineering was accelerating, and between 2013 and 2019 Boeing spent $43 billion on stock buybacks, not on R&D, not on workforce training, not on tooling, on buybacks, rewarding shareholders while the institutional knowledge of what made Boeing slowly evaporated, and 2 men understood this better than anyone. Because John Barnett was a quality manager at Boeing for 32 years and he didn't quit and write a Medium post. He filed formal complaints with the FAA. He alleged that workers were deliberately using substandard parts, that defects were being recorded as resolved when they weren't. The people who raised concerns were sidelined, and Barnett was scheduled to give further deposition testimony in 2024, and he died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in a hotel parking lot in South Carolina the morning he was supposed to testify, and the official finding was suicide, and his family disputes it, and Sam Salapour, a Boeing quality engineer, testified before the U.S. Senate in 2024, and described a culture where raising a safety concern wasn't just unwelcome, it was career-ending, where engineers were told to keep moving, keep building, meet the schedule, and he said he feared for his life after coming forward. And these aren't disgruntled employees blowing off steam. These are people with decades of engineering experience describing the same thing, independently, from different parts of the same company. And the culture had changed, and a changed culture doesn't show up in a quarterly report until it shows up in a hole in the side of a plane. In 2024, Boeing announced it would reacquire Spirit AeroSystems for approximately $4.7 billion. They were buying back the company they'd sold 20 years earlier. And think about what that means for a moment, because Boeing spent the 2000s telling the world that spinning off Spirit was smart, modern, efficient manufacturing strategy, and now they're spending nearly $5 billion to undo that decision. And there's no spin that makes that look good, no press release language that turns that into a victory lap, and it's a confession written in cash, and the logic of the deal is straightforward, even if the context is damning, because Boeing needs direct, unmediated control over fuselage production. They need to be able to walk into that Wichita factory at any hour and have absolute authority over every process, every check, every torque spec, and you can't do that with a vendor relationship. You can only do that with ownership, but ownership alone doesn't solve the cultural problem, and Boeing knows this, which is why the reacquisition is happening alongside something arguably more significant, because the FAA has implemented what they're calling a safety reset, and this isn't a fine, it isn't a 90-day corrective action plan. FAA inspectors are now permanently embedded inside Boeing's factories, not visiting, not auditing quarterly, living there effectively, with the authority to slow or halt production if standards aren't met, and that is an extraordinary level of oversight for a private manufacturer. It's the kind of thing you see in industries that have catastrophically lost the trust of the regulator, and it signals that the FAA no longer trusts Boeing's internal quality systems to self-police, which given everything seems like a reasonable position to take, and the question now is whether the hardware of the fix, the buyback, the embedded inspectors, the new management, can actually change the operating system underneath it. This is where Boeing stands today in 2026, and it's complicated, because on one hand, there are genuine signs of recovery, and Boeing has reopened and is ramping up its production line in Everett, Washington for the 777X program, and new hires are coming in, and there's a renewed emphasis, at least in messaging, on engineering leadership, and the new CEO, Kelly Ortberg, who took over in late 2024, came from the aerospace component world, not from finance, and that lineage matters, but the backlog of damage is still enormous, and the MAX 7 and MAX 10 variants are still fighting through the certification process with the FAA, and these are planes that airlines ordered years ago, and airlines like United and American have built capacity plans around deliveries that haven't come, and every month of delay is a cost. To the airlines, yes, but also to Boeing's cash position, and its relationship with customers who are increasingly eyeing Airbus with serious intent. And Airbus now holds the dominant market position in narrow-body jets, and a few years ago that would have been unthinkable, and today it's just the market. And then there's the workforce problem, because you can't buy institutional knowledge. And Boeing spent a decade and a half shedding experienced engineers through spin-offs, layoffs, and a culture that drove talented people out the door. And the people who are walking into that Wichita factory under the new Boeing ownership didn't build the reputation that made Boeing great, they're inheriting the wreckage of it, and building that knowledge base back takes years, probably a decade, possibly more, and there are some who work on the factory floor who will tell you the culture is actually shifting, that the new oversight feels real, that managers who used to dismiss quality concerns are gone, and that might be true, and it might also be what every post-crisis institution says in year one. So can Boeing buy back its soul? And here's the honest answer. Money can buy back Spirit AeroSystems, but it cannot buy back 2005, and you can write a check for a factory, but you cannot write a check for 20 years of institutional memory that was quietly, systematically liquidated in the name of shareholder returns. And you cannot compensate for the engineers who left, the whistleblowers who were ignored, the culture that told people their job was to hit the schedule and let someone else worry about the bolts, and the $4.7 billion is necessary, and so are the embedded inspectors, and so is the new leadership, and none of that is theater, but none of it is sufficient either, because Boeing's problem was never really about Spirit AeroSystems. Spirit was a symptom, and the disease was a boardroom philosophy that decided an airplane manufacturer should be run like a financial instrument, that engineers were a cost center, that quality was a variable and not a constant, and that philosophy left physical evidence, a door-sized hole at 16,000 feet, a whistleblower dead in a parking lot, a Senate hearing where a senior engineer said on the record that he feared for his life, and the question for Boeing, and honestly for every company watching this, isn't, can you reverse the damage once the damage is done? The question is whether you can change what you fundamentally believe your company is for, and Boeing used to believe it was for building the best planes in the world, and then it believed it was for returning value to shareholders, and now it's trying to figure out if it can be for planes again, and the $4.7 billion says it wants to. But corporations, like people, are not defined by what they spend, they're defined by what they do when it's hard, when the schedule is behind, when the budget is over, when someone on the factory floor flags a problem and the delivery date says, keep moving. And that's the moment that will define whether the old Boeing is coming back, or whether the photograph from 1968 is just that, a photograph. And if you want to understand how Boeing's 737 MAX crisis unfolded in technical detail, the full NTSB report is publicly available, and I'll link it in the description. And if you're new here, this channel covers the stories behind the headlines that most people never read to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.